right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Stephanie Hartley, and with my colleagues Elliott, Hopkins, Aftan, Snyder, and Arnest, we will be presenting Formulating National Strategy, Lessons from the Past, and Guidance for the Future. This study focuses on the process of making strategy, not what strategy should be. So as we continue, think process. Our client is the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, who has been hired by the Department of Defense to execute a congressionally mandated study addressing the Defense Strategy Formulation Challenge. Senior officials often undervalue the importance of the process, believing that they can shape decisions through their own expertise and personal experiences. Every administration has executed their strategy formulation process differently, and we can see this through the wide variety of products developed within the apparatus. Therefore, we are executing a study in conjunction with CSIS. The totality of the project, which is depicted, will cover the historical context and procedures, the analysis of 6 case studies conducted with recommendations for the Pentagon and Congress. Our responsibilities within the larger study are highlighted, and each will be discussed in detail. For the case studies, we've executed the 2001 Quadrennial Defense Review, the 2016 Australian White Paper, and again, both will be discussed in detail.
So our first responsibility for our client was an extensive literature review. As I go through this, I want you to remember that we're talking about how to build a process and how to build a strategy, not what those strategy goals should be. So in doing our literature review, we came up with 4 themes that are very important to consider when you're building a strategy. The first of these themes looks at process. How much structure should you build into your strategy? In the 1950s and 60s, planning started out as a very structured, formal, deliberate process, and very carefully considered all issues, but it had the downside that it had very little flexibility and very little continued learning or institutional knowledge retained. So in the 1970s, that led to a disillusionment with strategic planning overall, and a shift gradually into the 90s back to strategic planning, but in a way that was much more emergent, much more flexible, with a highlight on innovation and quick responsiveness to events, but with the downside of less control and more room for inconsistencies. Our second theme is leadership. You can balance a single visionary, or you can have a team effort, or you can do a mix of both, but whatever one you decide, you have to make it very clear at the very beginning of your strategy so that everybody knows what the game's going to be. Each of these has pros and cons. If you have a single leader, you can have a more tightly controlled, centralized process, but the downside of that is that then every single decision needs to be approved by your executive, and that can slow things down. If you have a team, the pro is that it can provide fresh perspectives and out-of-the-box thinking, but the con, another pro, it can add to the public credibility of your proposed solutions. The cons are you may implement decisions whose effects have not been properly considered across the entirety of your organization. Our third theme is the future environment. Is it foreseeable or is it unforeseeable? This basically is forecasting versus the inherent unknowability of the future. Forecasting can be very attractive for budgeting, investment, and competitive analysis, but it's impossible to get right every single time. Experts recommend that you find a balance between prediction and uncertainty by starting out with very broad commitments, moving forwards gradually toward more specific commitments as you build your strategy. Fourth and finally is competing influence. How are you going to incorporate your different stakeholders? These different stakeholders can be literally anyone. It can be members of Congress, it can be lobbyists, it can be unions and private workers, anyone. They have great sway over strategy formulation, especially depending on who's leading the process and what their ties are to the leadership. And their competing agendas can therefore really dilute the effectiveness of your strategy. So how do you get them on board? The easiest way is when you have a dominant, clear adversary. Absent that adversary, they're going to diffuse and pull you in enough different directions that your strategy will likely have some inevitable sort of incoherence. The best way to balance this is to recognize at the beginning that you're going to have to make decisions about pleasing some and not pleasing others, and you're going to have to live with the repercussions of that. So in conducting our analysis with our client, we decided that we needed to provide more granularity than just 4 themes. So we built it out into 12 variables, and these variables will align more closely with the actual decisions that DoD will have to make in their future strategy making. I'm not going to go through all of these right now because it's kind of a long list, and some of them will end up being more important for others. But the thing that you need to know right now is that we used all of these when we were conducting our case studies and built our case studies around these 4 questions. So the summary that you'll receive on the case studies will go through a couple of the specific important ones for that specific case study.
Our domestic case study was the 2001 QDR. QDR stands for Quadrennial Defense Review, which is a review mandated by Congress to occur every 4 years. The 2001 QDR was conducted by the Bush administration. President Bush empowered Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld to lead the process, and he did, got right in there immediately and started reaching out to actors outside of the government. This was because the senior advisors were not yet confirmed. These outside panels actually produced conflicting results, sometimes had conflicting resource allocation suggestions, but gradually over time, Rumsfeld was able to integrate the insiders as they were confirmed into the process as well. Still, this study did not really focus on potential restrictions on resource allocation. The most important thing about the 2001 QDR was that it was the first capabilities-based defense review for the US. Previous documents were threat-based. What that means is that the US would actually try to predict the most likely threats of the future and prepare for those. The capabilities-based model instead said we can't predict what the threats of the future are going to be, so we'll focus on what capabilities can help a wide range of threats. The problem with this model is that it led to very aspirational goals and lacked clear priorities. Now, the administration still stuck with the capabilities-based approach and used a big event, 9/11, to back up the need for this approach. It largely confirmed the capabilities-based model and was quickly written into the report, which was due on September 30th, 2011, to back the capabilities-based model.
Our other case study was the most recent of the 6 considered, a defense white paper published by Australia in 2016. The 30-month process spanned multiple administrations of government, and it was hailed as the most comprehensive and rigorous in Australia's history. It was the 7th in a series of white papers going back to 1976, continuing a trend of advocating an increased role for Australia in the Indo-Pacific and focusing more and more on global threats and challenges. Chief among these were the rise of China, resulting tension between China and the US, Islamic extremism and ISIS, Indo-Pakistan tensions, cyber threats, and general maritime expansion and military buildup in Southeast Asia. The process strove to align goals, resources, and capabilities, with the private sector providing an independent report seeking to align future strategy, capabilities, and resources for the future force. Overall, it was a procedural success with the direction and guidance coming from the Australian Ministry of Defense, analysis by outside panel of experts, buy-in from the public, and private sector cost estimates to ensure investment in the right basket of capabilities for long-term programs such as shipbuilding. Despite all these successes, it's still too soon to tell the overall success of the strategy, having only been published a year ago.
When it comes to policy recommendations, we found that strategy processes ultimately must accomplish many different and sometimes contradictory goals. And not only that, the process needs to adapt to the structure and the personality of the leadership. So as a result, our broad finding is that there is no one perfect process. Instead, the design of every process needs to involve choices that that you can choose from among many different options. So what are those options? Again, we talked about the 12 variables, but among those 12, we found that 3 most strongly and most frequently tend to drive the process in very different and particular directions. Those 3 are leadership, resources, and time. And again, leadership can be a single individual or a team, resources can be constrained or unconstrained, and time can be constrained or unconstrained. Each variable has key conditions within it too, which I just mentioned, and those conditions in turn drive decision-making in different directions and drive choices among the rest of the 12 variables. For example, leadership If you have a single leader, those are the 4 other variables that you have to consider if you want a successful strategy. You can do it differently, but your strategy will not be as workable. Similarly, if you have a team, you need to consider these 5. Rapidity, for instance. You need more time to sync up, but it needs to have boundaries. Priorities. You need to have more precise priorities in order to ensure success, because if you have a team, everyone's going to have different ideas about what should be done. Therefore, you need a clearer structure of what your priorities actually are. Resources, risk, outsiders. Again, all of these are critical in order to ensure a successful strategy. Second, if we're looking at resources, they can be constrained or they can be unconstrained. If they're constrained, you need to think about what your planning horizon is. That's why it's constrained. If you have constrained resources, then you have a very constrained planning horizon. You can't plan for 20 years in the future if you only have 5 years worth of resources. Similarly with unconstrained, these are the ones that you need to consider. If you have unconstrained resources, for instance, looking at leadership, you have more room for either a single leader or diffuse leadership to teams. Finally, looking at time, if you're going to have a short timeline, your leader needs to be a single, strong individual who can very clearly drive the planning process. You can have a very tightly knit team, but the burden is higher on that team to drive planning in a strong way. Similarly, process, resources, insiders, outsiders, priorities, these are the things that have to be done in a certain way. Now, you can consider the rest of the variables in these 3 pathways as well. They won't be as important to the success of your strategy, and they can go either way, which is why we didn't include them up here. So what does this mean overall? It means that our key insight is that DoD has very wide latitude in designing their strategy formulation process, and they need to make choices consciously. They should not simply rerun prior processes because that's what they've always done before. There needs to be clearer choices. They need to do 2 things in particular. First, they need to recognize and consider the 4 themes from the literature review that I mentioned, which again, that's the type of process, the type of leadership, the future environment, and your external actors. And finally, you have to discuss each of the 12 variables and make explicit decisions among them, particularly remembering the 3 that we discussed, resources, time, and leadership, because those 3 are the ones that will most strongly guide how you plan your process. So given that, are there any questions for us?